From a blood spatter analyst by day and a serial killer by night to a bizarre lumberjack twist, Dexter's evolution has been wild and unpredictable. With multiple series under its belt, it's time to decide which one stands out and which should stay buried. Coming in at number 4 is Early Cuts, the weird, artsy little sibling of the franchise. If you've never heard of it, don't worry, you're not alone. This was a web series that Showtime threw out there and then promptly forgot about. But honestly, it's kinda cool. So, what even is Early Cuts? Well, imagine if someone took the idea of a Dexter prequel, removed all the high-budget production, and gave us hand-drawn illustrations and watercolor paintings. Yeah, this wasn't a live-action series. It was an animated web series with narration from Michael C. Hall himself, which, let's be honest, is the main reason why it even feels like Dexter at all. If it had been someone else's voice, we probably wouldn't even acknowledge this existed. The premise was simple. It filled in some gaps from Dexter's early years, basically showing us the period between Harry teaching Dexter the code and Dexter becoming the fully formed dark passenger we meet in Season 1. That sounds like a goldmine, right? The potential for more deep dives into young Dexter's psyche, more darkly poetic monologues, more of that twisted satisfaction we get when he hunts down bad guys? Well, yes and no. Early Cuts had a unique vibe. The art style was gritty, rough, and kind of hypnotic in its way. It almost felt like watching Dexter's inner thoughts play out on paper, like reading his twisted journal. And, of course, having Michael C. Hall narrate was a masterstroke. His voice is just so tied to the character that even if the animation wasn't the most engaging, his delivery made it feel legit. Another thing that worked? The new kills. This show gave us a few fresh Dexter kills that weren't in the main series. Some of them were pretty inventive, and you can see the early stages of his technique development. It was also interesting to watch him learn from his mistakes. In the main show, Dexter is already a professional at this whole serial killer who kills bad people thing. But here, he's still figuring things out, still making missteps. That made it feel real in a way we don't often get to see. Now, let's be real. Early Cuts had some serious limitations. First off, the episodes were ridiculously short. Some were only 3 minutes long. That's barely enough time to get invested before it's over. You just start getting into a scene and then bam, credits roll. It's like eating a single Pringle when you're starving. It just leaves you wanting more. Then there's the fact that it never really had a story. It was more like little snapshots of Dexter's past, without a strong, overarching narrative to keep you hooked. Compared to Dexter, Original Sin, which is now giving us a fully fleshed-out prequel, Early Cuts feels more like a rough draft. And the animation. Now, I respect the attempt to do something different, but let's be honest, it looked like one of those motion comics you'd see on YouTube in the early 2000s and 10s. The art was decent, but the animation was the bare minimum. It was a slideshow with Michael C. Hall reading over it. If you're someone who loves Dexter's deep monologues, then it's fine. But if you were expecting action, this ain't it. So, where does Early Cuts land in the Dexter ranking? It's the weakest of the bunch, but not because it was bad. It's just forgettable. If you're a hardcore Dexter fan, it's worth checking out, if only for the extra lore. But if you're a casual fan who just wants more of the classic Dexter experience, you're not missing much. And now that we have Dexter, Original Sin covering similar ground, but in a way more engaging way, Early Cuts has lost its place in the franchise. That being said, it's still cool to think about. It was Showtime's first attempt at expanding the Dexter universe beyond the main show, and it was kind of an experimental, artsy project. For that, it deserves some credit. But would I ever put it on the same level as the other Dexter shows? Nah. Alright, that's one down. Next up, we have a show that should have been the perfect send-off for Dexter. But, well, let's just say it didn't quite stick the landing. Let's talk about New Blood. The revival that had us all hyped, and then left us feeling kind of betrayed. This show was supposed to fix everything, right? After the way the original series ended, with Dexter becoming a lumberjack, which felt like an insult to everyone who stuck with the show for 8 seasons, New Blood came along like a second chance. Showtime said, "Hey, we know we messed up. Let's try this again." And for a while, it felt like they were nailing it. The setup was great. We see Dexter living in the small, snowy town of Iron Lake, going by the name Jim Lindsay, a nice little nod to Jeff Lindsay, the author of the Dexter books. He's been keeping his dark passenger locked up for years, living this quiet, uneventful life, until of course things go sideways. Because let's be real, there was zero chance Dexter was going to live out his life without giving in to his urges. And the way they handled his relapse? It was done well. But the biggest twist? Harrison. Bringing back Dexter's son was a brilliant move. Suddenly, we weren't just dealing with Dexter's struggle. We had to wonder if his darkness had been passed down to the next generation. Is Harrison just a regular traumatized kid? Or does he have his dark passenger waiting to come out? That whole father-son dynamic was hands down the best part of the show. It gave us something new, something different, something that made it feel like Dexter was evolving as a character. And for most of the season, it felt like they were building towards something huge. The cat-and-mouse game between Dexter and Angela Bishop was tense. Clancy Brown as Kurt Caldwell was a solid villain, and we got some amazing callbacks to the original series, especially with Deb being Dexter's new ghost mentor. Seeing her take on Harry's old role, but in a more chaotic, guilt-driven way, was such a nice touch. It felt like the show understood what made Dexter great. And then, they fumbled. Hard. Look, I'm not saying Dexter shouldn't have died. If they were going to kill him off, fine. But the way they did it? It felt rushed, forced, and completely out of character. The entire series, Dexter has been insanely careful, to the point of being almost untouchable. And yet, in the final episode, he suddenly starts making the dumbest mistakes imaginable. Like, seriously, why did he kill Logan? That was so out of character for him. If the whole point was for Dexter to realize he was the monster, they could have built that up properly. Instead, they just rushed through it in the last episode, like they suddenly decided, oh crap, we have to wrap this up. And then there's Harrison. His whole arc should have been about breaking the cycle, about proving that he isn't his father. But the way they did it? It felt forced. Like, 1 minute, he's confused about who he is, and the next, he's 100% convinced that his dad deserves to die. It just didn't feel earned. If anything, it would have been way more interesting if Dexter had lived and we got a proper exploration of Harrison choosing to be different. So where does New Blood stand in the Dexter rankings? It's a bit better than the animation because, again, lumberjack, and the first half of the season was genuinely great. But that finale, it kind of ruins everything. It had the potential to be legendary, to finally give us the satisfying ending we deserved. Instead, it left us feeling robbed. But this next series was genuinely better. Coming in at number 2 is Dexter. Original Sin. Now we're stepping into uncharted territory with Dexter. Original Sin, and I gotta be honest, I have mixed feelings. On one hand, a prequel about young Dexter? That's insanely exciting. We finally get to see the full transformation of Dexter Morgan, from an awkward kid with disturbing urges to the cold, calculated killer we meet in Season 1. That sounds perfect, right? But on the other hand, we've been burned before. We know Showtime loves to milk this franchise, and after the New Blood finale, I think a lot of us are still a little traumatized. The question is, will they get it right this time? Original Sin set in 1991 when Dexter is in his early 20s, still figuring out how to follow the code. He's not the smooth, confident predator we know yet. He's still learning, still making mistakes, still being shaped by Harry's rules. And honestly, this is a side of Dexter we've never really seen before. The original show gave us some flashbacks, sure, but we never got a full, detailed look at how Dexter became the monster we ended up rooting for. And then there's the big question. Who's playing Dexter? Because let's be real, Michael C. Hall is Dexter. His voice, his expressions, that creepy yet weirdly charming vibe, it's impossible to imagine anyone else filling those shoes. But they've cast Patrick Gibson in the role, and while he's got the look, he also acted the part very well. And let's not forget Harry Morgan. They cast Christian Slater to play him, which is honestly perfect. Harry is such a crucial character. He's the one who shaped Dexter, who drilled the code into his head, who taught him how to channel his urges. If they mess up Harry, they mess up the entire show. But I have to say, Christian Slater has that grizzled, seen-too-much energy that could work. Now, let's talk about what they need to get right. First off, the kills. This is a young Dexter, which means his technique shouldn't be perfect yet. He should be making mistakes, learning as he goes. Maybe his first kills are messy, maybe he almost gets caught, and maybe we see him struggle with the weight of what he's doing before he fully embraces it. If they just make him an instant prodigy, it's gonna feel lazy. We need to see the trial and error, the close calls, the lessons learned, but with few episodes in, I think they are doing just that. And then there's the dark passenger. In the original show, it always felt like Dexter's dark passenger was fully formed by the time we met him. But here, it should still be developing. I want to see those moments where he's questioning himself, where he's scared of what he's becoming, where Harry has to convince him that the code is the only way. Because let's be real, Dexter didn't just wake up one day and say, "Yup, I'm fine with being a serial killer." There had to be conflict, and that's what could make this show interesting. But my biggest concern? The writing. Because we've seen Showtime screw this up before. If they make this just another generic crime drama, or worse, try to make Dexter too relatable, it's not going to work. We know Dexter becomes a monster. The appeal of a prequel isn't making us sympathize with him. It's making us understand how he got there. If they try to soften him up too much or make it seem like, oh, poor Dexter, he had no choice, it's going to feel cheap. That being said, I hope they pull this off. There's so much potential here. Young Dexter, young Deb, early Miami Metro, the first time Dexter puts the code into practice. If they do this right, it could be one of the best Dexter stories ever told. But if they screw it up, well, let's just say I'm not emotionally prepared for another lumberjack-level disappointment. Alright, so that's where we stand with Dexter. Original Sin. There's a lot to be excited about, but also a lot to be worried about. Now, we've talked about all the Dexter shows, but what about the best ones? Let's get into the top ranking and finally settle on which Dexter series truly deserves the top spot. Before we talk about the next show, let's talk about something just as important as following the code: subscribing to the channel. See, every great predator knows that survival is all about adaptation, and for this channel to thrive, we need you. A simple click, and you become part of something bigger. Something darkly significant. So go on, hit that subscribe button. It won't hurt a bit. Unlike some of Dexter's hobbies. Now back to the video. Dexter. The show that kicked it all off is the reason we even have this franchise in the first place. When Dexter first dropped in 2006, it felt like something different. Back then, crime dramas were all about detectives solving murders, not a serial killer solving murders while also being a serial killer. It flipped the whole genre on its head. Instead of rooting for the cop trying to catch the bad guy, we were rooting for the bad guy trying to not get caught. And somehow, it worked. A huge part of why it worked? Michael C. Hall. I mean, come on. This guy was Dexter. His deadpan delivery, the way he made you sympathize with a literal psychopath, the little moments where he'd flash a sinister smile when no one was looking. Absolute perfection. If someone else had played Dexter, I don't think the show would have been nearly as iconic. And then there's the Code of Harry. This was one of the smartest moves the show ever made. Dexter wasn't just some mindless killer. He had rules. His adoptive father, Harry, saw the darkness in him from a young age and decided, all right, if you're gonna kill, at least make it useful. So, Dexter only went after bad people, murderers, rapists, the absolute scum of the earth. That's what made him so fascinating. He wasn't just a monster. He was a monster with a moral compass. Kind of. Seasons 1 through 4? Peak television. The ice truck killer twist? Mind-blowing. The Dokes rivalry? Iconic.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Is still one of the greatest TV moments of all time. And then, of course, Season 4. Season 4. The Trinity Killer arc. Easily one of the best seasons of any show ever. John Lithgow as Arthur Mitchell? Chilling. He was the perfect antagonist for Dexter. Someone who seemed like a normal family man on the outside but was an absolute monster underneath. And that finale? If you know, you know. I still remember sitting there staring at my screen in shock like, did they just do that? Then things got messy. Season 5 was decent but never quite hit the same level. Season 6 had the weird Doomsday Killer thing, which felt more like a random horror movie than a Dexter season. And then we got to Seasons 7 and 8, where everything started falling apart. Deb finding out about Dexter? That should have been the moment that changed everything. And while it was great at first, the show fumbled the bag. And then, the finale. Oh God, the finale. You already know. If you've watched Dexter, you know how much that ending pissed people off. Dexter fakes his death and becomes a lumberjack. A lumberjack. That's how they thought his story should end? I mean, I get that they didn't want to just kill him off in a predictable way, but come on. It felt like such a letdown after years of build-up. They didn't know how to end it, so they just gave up. And that's why, for years, fans were begging for a proper ending, which lead to Dexter. New Blood, which, well, we already talked about how that turned out. But honestly, despite how messy the later seasons got, despite that finale, Dexter is still one of the most unique shows ever made. So, where does it rank? Well, it's number one. The original series, despite its flaws, is still the best thing this franchise ever gave us. Nothing beats the early seasons. Nothing beats the thrill of watching Dexter stalk his prey, hearing his inner monologues, and watching him juggle his double life. It had some of the best moments in TV history, and when it was good, it was untouchable. So yeah, for all its ups and downs, Dexter is still the king. And honestly, I kind of miss it, and if you do, well, maybe it is time you watched it again. But before you do that, give me your thoughts in the comments section and dive into the next thrilling Dexter video for more intense insight.